how do you explain to someone that you're an empathic person or compassionate person is different depending on the conversation, depending on the context, depending if you're in an interview or you're talking to your date, potential partner. You're still talking about the same strength.
How did you get into strengths and learn about strengths as a coach?
I'll make it as a coach, light the spark inside, empower every soul to turn the tide. I'll make it as a coach, help others grow, changing lives with every story I know.
The development concept that influenced me the most in the last years definitely is strengths. Using the language of strengths has really helped me to get a better understanding of who I am, how I want to talk about myself, and what my sweet spot in life and in work can be. So today and next week on The Making of a Coach, we'll experiment with a new format and run a strengths coaching special, unpacking how my guest works with strengths in coaching. My guest, that is Taina Nicolicin. She's a Romanian living in London, and some time ago, Taina has in fact been my coach, accompanying me on that strengths journey. So on today's session, we'll hear from Taina how she is using strength psychology in coaching. And as so often, I started by having her choose a photo, this time on the question, what is strengths work for you? Let's see what she has to say.
Okay. What strength work for me? I've chosen the picture because I actually just see now that the fingers sort of are what forms a star. Initially, I saw it as a star that's being held by several hands. Strength work for me, I think if I was to describe it in a nutshell, is about strengthening your connections with others. And that can be your family relationships, your personal relationships, at work, etc. I am a firm believer that once you are able to not only identify what your strengths are and also what your weaknesses and growing edges are, not only identifying them, but also being able to articulate them to others and bring them into the tangible of your life, it will improve your relationships with others tenfold. So it's just the sort of fingers of different people being connected to each other. And then I guess almost the metaphor of the star as well, sort of, I guess, links into strength, because I guess you're a shiny version of yourself once you're really knowledgeable about what you're good at and what are some of the things that you don't enjoy doing as much. A star version of yourself, shiny version of yourself. And I guess others see that shine as well.
Yeah, the characteristics that make you shine on the one hand, and then also this ability to connect to the other people on the other. Yeah. And how did you experience that in your own journey of finding your strengths, becoming more aware, being able to name them?
I guess this became so much more prevalent when I moved countries. So I was originally born in Romania, and I was there until I was about 23. That's when I moved to the UK. And when I moved to the UK, of course, my mind got really busy with learning a new culture. There was so much, happening, a new language, etc. So there was basically a lot happening. And very quickly, I almost felt like my sense of identity and maybe a bit my confidence were sort of knocked back. That was weird for me because I was always a person who sort of knew herself, knew how to describe herself. So it was weird for me, I guess, to experience that. And that was the first time when I guess I started doing sort of psychometric assessments, some of strengths, some of different types. And I guess they've slowly but surely started to form a language for me to express who I am in a pointy way, rather than talk about so many things that I could talk about when I talk about myself. I was able to be more pointy in conversations when was needed, for example, in job interviews.
Yeah. So basically enabling you to answer the question, who who am I? And then derive from that, okay, what does that mean for my job? What does that mean how I want to introduce myself? And it sounds a little bit like this was also your experience, or how do you relate to this?
Yeah, and I guess like what sort of springs to mind is almost this multifaceted use of strengths, isn't it? Because as you look at one strength, let's take empathy, for instance, or compassion. How do they show up? How do you use them in conversations? How do you explain to someone that you're an empathic person or a compassionate person? Is different depending on the conversation, depending on the context, depending if you're in an interview or you're talking to your date, potential partner. You're still talking about the same strength. It's still you. It's still the way you're defining yourself, but it's very different depending on the scenario and on the context that you find yourself in.
How did you get into strengths and learn about strengths as a coach?
So I think I had already a love for strengths, if you want, that has sort of developed from my personal journey and personal circumstances, as I shared earlier. So I've probably had, when I've done my coaching training, I want to say that I already had maybe 6 or 7 different profiles done of my own strengths. So I pretty much sort of tested quite a few of them. And then after my training has finished and sort of I was going to my practice hours, one of the things that I've noticed the most was that my clients were coming to coaching with a range of sort of different topics that they wanted to explore. There was always some level of discomfort involved. So that was sort of the context. And what I was noticing is that as we were going through our sessions, sooner or later, we would come to this topic of confidence or inner confidence. There was just something about that needed to be explored. And I guess strengths was one of the easy ways that I found that made such a massive difference in a person's life. So once we would sort of do their strengths profile, talk about it, come back to it in different conversations in coaching, it was just phenomenal, the impact that it had on their confidence. There's so many other models, so many different tools out there, but I just found it a really simple and effective way to work on that. So that's how strengths ended up in my coaching practice. Then, of course, I had to choose, in which ones I'm going to train, which of the strengths profiles out there I'm going to choose to train in. I do believe that it's important that we know what we're good at and we're using what we're good at, but what's most important than anything in this world to me and also in my work, I guess I bring that element, is that we need to be happy. We need to feel good as much as we can in our day-to-day life.
So bringing the strength in this context of subjective well-being in a way. How would you define the term strength or what makes a strength according to this model?
Yeah, so for me, it is, of course, driven from this model, but also I would say that I now almost hold it like a firm belief that is something that you're really good at. So that's one component. It's something that you use a lot, or, like it's not just something that, I'm a really good public speaker, let's say, but I actually don't, engage in public speaking at all. Well, that wouldn't be what I would call a realized strength. So maybe we can go into realized and unrealized later. But yeah, something that you're really good at, something that you use a lot, and something that makes you feel good when you're using it. So it brings you joy, it fills you with energy, gives you that good feeling.
It sounds to me like, okay, a strength is sort of a verb, but it could also be like public speaker. That's sort of a role, a noun, something I identify with. Does it make sense, or how would you, from this perspective?
I guess it makes sense because you could have like the role that you're playing, like for example, the public speaker, but then what are some of the strengths that you're displaying when you're public speaking? So yeah, I guess we could distinguish, but also I also don't think that there's a difference, if that makes sense, because it's you as the person showing up in a role. It's still the strengths that you have that are going to shape how you show up in that role, if that makes sense. I don't know if I'm explaining that right, but it makes sense in my head.
Yeah, so strengths are activities then. So something that I pursue and that brings out that strength of mine.
Yes, I guess we could say that there are activities as well. I'm just a bit like, I don't want to say I'm conflicted, but there's almost like a bridge in some cases, I guess, that's created between something that we're feeling and something that we're doing that creates the strength in a way. So it's not always just outward, if that makes sense. Self-belief, for instance, is one of the strengths, right? But that's not really about an activity, isn't it? It's more of this almost inner sense of ourselves, maybe more linked to our feelings than to activities. So it's not so black and white, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. There's also this question, I guess, of like, and I come across this often around sort of what's a skill, so something that you can just develop. How much of our strengths can come from things that we choose to develop? And some people will argue that no, some people are just naturally good at this and that. And yes, I do believe that all of us have things that we're just naturally good at. And those would normally sit in your realized strengths. Without you doing any work, without you choosing to develop any of your strengths, you will have some, let's call them natural gifts, right? I do believe that there is a way to develop like strengths as well. So I guess the sort of developed skill part can also become a strength given the right circumstances and being used in the right way. And we come back to that joy if it brings you joy. Mm-hmm. And that's the stumbling part often. So I see a lot of focus on let's do something well. Let's make sure that we're doing it. Let's develop strategies to make sure that we're displaying that strength. But often that doesn't make us feel better. That doesn't bring us much joy when we're displaying that particular strength. For me, that doesn't work. There's people who might choose to sort of work in that way. That's just not the way I work with strength. Mm-hmm.
So what I take from your answering and sort of also refusing to answer my question is I think that in the end, it doesn't matter what is true. In the end, it matters what is useful, sort of.
Yeah,
when it comes to
exactly.
strengths.
That's a very good way of putting it. Yeah. Less important what is true, because we get caught up in our cognitive learning a lot. And I think that's a very beautiful way of saying it. It doesn't really matter what is true as long as it is useful.
Nice. Before we dive deeper into how these strengths actually work, I would like to circle back a bit earlier to what you said about how you're using it. Because if I'm trying to paraphrase, what you basically said was that in many instances, what comes up in client conversations is sort of this theme of lack of confidence or uncertainty about even identity, possibly. How does the client arrive, and how do you then pull out the strengths theme?
So maybe some tangible examples. A client may come to coaching saying, I'm having some communication challenges with my husband in my marriage, for instance. By working on those communication challenges, it's sort of you would say the two are almost unrelated, right? Like your instinct as a coach would not be, let me suggest to this person that they should take a strengths profile, right? When I say that out loud, you would be like, well, what's going on with her? Surely there's a lot of other things that you should be exploring there. But think about this. If I suggest to that person, well, okay, let's park the conversation for today or for these 2 sessions. Let's do a strengths profile. Let's talk about that. And then we'll come back to this conversation. Now, once that person becomes really clear on what they're really good at, what they enjoy doing, what are some of the areas where they may be, there is an area in the strengths profiles that I use, which is called learned behaviors, which are things that we are really good at and we could use a lot or not, but that drain us, right? So we display something, but we don't enjoy doing it. So maybe one of the strengths could be prevention, for instance. So in our example, this person could spend a lot of their day-to-day trying to prevent things from happening, maybe bills being unpaid or etc. And they don't actually enjoy doing that at all. And that's maybe one of the root causes that the communication with their partner has fallen down. But you don't really get under the hood so quickly of what's happening if you approach the conversation, I guess, in a different way. So I guess to bring it back, it's almost like it's a shortcut to a lot of the things. It crystallizes who the person is. And by looking at their profile, they have so many sort of self-realizations that they can then link in their head to the challenge or the change or the sort of topic of conversation that they came to coaching with. It's more about like knowing who you are as a person more than anything, I think. Like for me, that's almost like the starting point of anything. So when I was saying that like people come to coaching with a range of different topics, but sooner or later throughout, I also do transformative coaching. I guess maybe I should have clarified that in the beginning. So there's those sort of these layers of coaching where, yes, we can just go, what's your goal? Let's design a plan. How do we get there? Evaluate there. So that's not my work. Like my work is sort of going a lot sort of deeper under the iceberg, if you want. So sooner or later, we end up in this place of, well, are you really clear on who you are? What do you want? What do you enjoy doing? Do you have absolute clarity on those things before we start diving into everything else out there? And that's the reason why I like strengths, I use strength, and that's why I believe that strengths work is so effective. Once you become really clear on yourself, there's a lot more clarity on all of those perceived challenges that you may have had at the start of your journey, if you want.
So a strength is something that I do on a regular basis. And what is it that gives me energy? What is it that I enjoy? And these two elements, they give me then an idea of who I am, you're saying.
It gives you a good idea of who you are, but it's not, I would say that's almost like the first step or the first block of okay, I'm gaining awareness into who I am, what I'm really good at, what are some of the things that drain me, what brings me joy, where do I spend most of my time doing, or, what do I spend most of my time displaying, and what are some of the things that I don't really, display a lot, etc. Then there's this almost second step of well, how am I articulating that? How do I talk about those things with other people? How do I develop the skills and the language to articulate in a clear way all of those things? And then there's almost a third layer that I work on, as in, well, how do I exhibit them? How do I show them? How do they show up in my work life? How do they show up in my relationship? How do they show up in my friendships, etc.? So yeah, I guess gaining the awareness, developing the communication skills to articulate them, and then developing mechanisms of applying them, dialing up some of the ones that you want to dial up, dialing down some of the ones that you may be overusing, having discernment around which ones do you want to continue using or maybe not use so much if they're draining you. All of those things.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned now this notion of overusing. Maybe our example coaching client who struggles in the communication with her husband related to some of her strengths and overusing them, or how would you actually get back the conversation now to the actual issue of the client that you originally started out with before diving into strengths?
So we're talking about overuse, underuse?
That's a good question. After exploring now the strengths, there's some that you realize that you deploy very much in everyday life. There's others that maybe you even deploy too much. So you use this term overuse.
Yeah.
What would you derive from that with the client?
So if we are to sort of think about the client that's the atypical strengths client, the one that comes to discuss an improvement in communication with their partner, we may have strengths like, let's say, pride, for instance, or prevention that are being overused. That could show up as whenever there's a disagreement, they would find it really hard to go back and acknowledge that they may have approached the disagreement in a way that didn't make them proud. So that pride strength, which could be very useful in some scenarios, can become a real hindrance in their personal life. So once the client gains the awareness, I guess, of, okay, pride is a realized strength of mine. I feel good when, I display it. I'm good at it, all of those things. But then you get to that part of like, well, how does it show up? So that third level of, okay, how does this show up in your personal life? How does it show up in your work life? How does it show up with your friends? And they start thinking about some of those tangible examples. They may have, it's not guaranteed, but they may have their realization that, oh, well, in that work context, pride, is very useful. But when used in my relationship with my partner is actually a hindrance. So maybe I'll try and develop some strategies to dial it down in my personal life. Similar with prevention, for instance, isn't it? If you think about preventing risk, like things that would bring risk to an organization at work, it's very useful to have that strength. But again, in your personal life, if you're always the preventer, your partner might be feeling that you're becoming a bit controlling or that it may hinder your relationship. So I guess that's how I would go about it in terms of, are you overusing it in that particular context?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you now put it very much as a question of context. So pride can help me if I'm public speaking. I really enjoy this. I'm really in my element. I can also take others with me on a vision, on a journey as a public speaker. But then if I'm communicating, it might also hold me back from being vulnerable because it sort of hurts my pride. And is it like that, Kat?
Yeah, absolutely. As I was saying, depending on the context, it's just about that usefulness, as we were talking about earlier, isn't it? It's not about, I guess, good or bad. It's just about what's useful in that context, what's useful in that situation. What would you want to be doing in that context? You may be a person who's going to say, well, no, actually, pride is quite important to me to display even in my relationship, and hindering my vulnerability is not, it's not something that I want to work on. You might have clients who choose to go that way. So it's more about what does the client want to do. And I always find it so surprising what sort of comes back. Some of the things that I would expect, like if we're thinking about your example from earlier, of a client having the realization that pride may be preventing them from being vulnerable, you would expect them to sort of take that realization and that being something that they want to work on so they can maybe, increase their level of vulnerability when in relationship with their partner. That's not always the case. So I guess meeting the client where they're at and where do they want to go is also a very important part of this equation.
So there is this element of staying non-judgmental in a way. On the one hand, I think strengths might help there because framing certain behaviors and characteristics as strengths but kind of brings this inherent non-judgmentalness, if that's a word. And on the other hand, you're also saying, okay, I as a coach, I might still come in with my own set of values saying, okay, I value XYZ more than ABC. And I have this notion of, okay, this should be obviously, quote unquote, something that we should work on. But you're saying basically this is also important to keep that in mind, that it's still the client who determines what to work on in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I guess like your example, I guess, was really good of like how pride in a relationship, in a personal relationship, majority of us, I guess, we would look at that and be like, oh, yes, that's really preventing me from being vulnerable. So I would like to focus on that because it's important. Like we would recognize that in our relationship, it's important to be vulnerable. That's maybe what most people would say, but it's not all of them. Some people may say, well, no, being vulnerable with my partner, yes, maybe it's important, but not so important as my pride.
Yeah, and I think I would also like to circle back to this question of context, because right now we are differentiating between the work context, being a good public speaker, for example, versus the personal life, me and my partner struggling. And I guess there is also like plenty of nuances in between where this pride might be an asset as a public speaker, but it might also actually hold me back in a one-on-one conversation or in daily interactions with my colleagues when it's not about being on stage, but it's about relating to each other. This might not be my romantic partner connect to, and where this pride might be in the way if overused.
Absolutely. And then you could also think about the way we would be working on that is by looking at some of the other strengths that you may have that could help bring that connection in those other relationships if pride is perceived to be a hindering factor. Depending on what other strengths you might have, maybe you have things like relationship deepener or maybe connector, some of those strengths alongside pride. It's just about that dial, isn't it? Of like, well, how can we dial up in conversations, in social conversations when I'm not on stage? How can we dial up some of those other strengths and slightly dial down this pride? Or sort of, becoming more aware of it, if that's what you're doing.
Yeah. So thinking back of that coaching situation, me and the client coming with a certain issue, for example, the communication with the husband, what I hear is that this strengths catalog that we now unboxed by doing that profile together, that gives me sort of a set of behavioral resources, let's say, that I can, as a client, go back to and see, interesting, there is this stuff that I am already doing and I might enjoy it so much that I'm overdoing it, possibly. But then there's also this other box of behaviors that I might actually enjoy, but I'm not doing that so much. Can you explain that a bit more, this notion of realized and unrealized strengths? Like, how does this whole strength psychology framework look like?
So strengths profiles basically the assessment and the result of the assessment that you take, and the assessment is very similar to, as you would expect, you answer questions, like it's sort of standard in that way. The result, however, strengths into 4 boxes, and the top sort of boxes, so I guess let me actually talk about all of them maybe because it's useful. So you have a box of weakness, which is the controversial one from a wording. So it's interesting how we also relate to words. Weaknesses in positive psychology maybe is a bit like we should not call them weaknesses, we should call them areas of growth, etc. I personally really like the fact that the assessment calls them weaknesses. I do believe that there's so much value in us knowing that, that is a weakness of mine. I am aware of it, and actually that is not something that I want to, develop and etc. We sort of spend far too much time trying to, become good or maybe average at everything. And I think there is value in us saying, no, I'm actually not good at those things, and I don't want to become good at those things. That's not me, that's just another person. So that's one of the boxes. Then we have a box that's called learned behaviors. These are things that we are good at. We may use a lot or not, so it's sort of a variable use. The key point here is that they don't bring us joy. So there's that joy factor. So these are things that drain us. We do them well, we do them a lot or not so much, but they do always drain us. They don't bring us joy. Then you have your realized strengths. These are the strengths that the things that you do well, you really enjoy doing, and you do a lot, so you display a lot. And then the last box is unrealized strengths. This is my sort of favorite box. I would call it maybe the untapped potential, if you want. So these are the strengths that you are good at. They bring you joy, or they would bring you joy, I guess is the better way of saying it, because you don't use them as much. So almost like a treasure box, so you have all of these gifts that you're not really using. So this is where I would work with clients to sort of unleash that untapped potential.
So we have weaknesses, learned behaviors, realized strengths, and unrealized strengths. And the difference, if I get it right, is that all what we call strengths, both the realized and unrealized, is what we enjoy, what gives us energy.
Yeah.
While the learned behaviors and the weaknesses, we don't enjoy, it sort of drains our battery. And then we make this additional distinction of realized strengths are the ones that I'm actually using, while unrealized strengths are the ones that I don't have access to.
Yes. Whereas with learned behaviors and weaknesses, they're both things that don't bring us joy, but the difference between them is the weaknesses, you're not good at them either. So it's not only that they don't bring you joy, but you're not good at them either. Whereas the learned behaviors, there are things that you're really good at. So there's resources available on their website to look at if you want to dive deeper into the data. But interestingly, what sits in the learned behaviors for majority of the people, so majority of the profiles, are things that we learned as it's almost like societal norms that we need to be good at, we need to be doing. It's interesting how that's the case, because those things don't bring us joy at all, but we became really good at doing them. You might have something like compassion is often a learned behavior.
And this is sort of, as far as I know, the second generation of positive psychology research. So there were Martin Seligman, the guy who also came up with the positive psychology PERMA framework, who kind of kicked this whole strengths terminology off. And then Ryan Niemiec, the person behind the VR character strengths, sort of built on that. And then there is Alex Linley, who basically came up with this element of, okay, there's energy, there is this, how often do I use it? And there's the, how well do I perform? That basically then use these measures to categorize them into these 4 boxes. And I think that's actually used by a couple of different frameworks. So Capfinity on the one hand, there's also the high 5 strengths assessment. And also at metaFox, we also decided to now go for this framework. So that's sort of the state-of-the-art positive psychology understanding of strengths, as far as I know.
Yeah, definitely. I would say state-of-the-art. It's so good to hear that you're going to be focusing on that at metaFox as well. I do think that it's almost like, I don't want to say it's underestimated, but maybe not focused on enough. This is just talking from my personal sort of journey of, as I said, like I've done, several strengths profiles. I've had, different debriefs about the strengths profile. So, with different coaches, not necessarily that they would call themselves all a coach. And yeah, through my personal journey, it's almost like there was this missing, I don't want to say missing, but not focused on enough. That's the right way of saying it. Joy and happiness and sort of the level of energy that we get when we're displaying a behavior that's based on that strength, or when we're doing some of those things, is of paramount importance. And it makes the work that you're trying to do a lot easier as well. So if you want to start focusing on becoming more empathic as a person, if you have no joy when you're trying to empathize with another human being, like if that doesn't, once you've tried to focus on that and you walk away from that conversation and you feel completely drained and you feel like that wasn't something that brought you any joy.
So actually using the strengths and following these cues basically turns on the easy mode in development, you're sort of saying.
Yes, absolutely. That it's all about what's effective, what's more an efficient way of doing it. We live in a world where everybody wants the fastest results in the easiest way possible. And when it comes to personal growth, it doesn't always work that way. But I do think that by knowing how to fine-tune the process, you can get to results quicker rather than having a slower progress curve.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I think now we pretty much unpacked the strengths journey and also this whole question of what are strengths in the positive psychology research. We really came a bit from this. In the very beginning, you said, okay, you either come from this goal of personal development in general, or you come from the concrete issue. And of course, coming now from the personal development perspective, not coming with a concrete issue initially, but then deriving the issues from what we see in the profile.
Yeah. So what could also be common if you think about in an organizational context, right? Very often organizations may choose to contract me as a coach to come in. So all of the organization would do strengths profiles, all of their employees. They would have manager profiles, they would have team profiles, they would have the leadership profile for the leaders. So we wouldn't start from a challenge. We would start from, okay, the whole organization has their strengths profiles done, and we would commence from there and then derive the challenges or issues from that. The other way is, of course, where you have already a challenge that you're coming to coaching with, and I then introduce strengths as a way of working around that.
Yeah, and there you're also sort of mentioning two different use cases now, right? On the one hand, we have sort of the one-on-one coaching. There is a certain issue that the client comes with.
Yeah.
And the other one is more of a team development, leadership development case. Let's explore how would that look like. You said the organization contracts everybody in the team has done a profile.
Yeah.
How would you continue?
So I think there's more and more focus. This is just deriving from my experience. I'm a director of people and finance for one of the students' unions in the UK. And what I'm seeing more and more in workplaces is this focus of how do we change our work culture? How do we bring coaching into the workplace? How do we develop talent? How do we recruit more effective? There's so much focus in the workplace on all of these strands, and strengths work or strengths profiles, I think, is becoming more and more of a buzzword in the workplace. So that's the context of what I'm seeing. Now, how does it work in the workplace? So it would start, I guess, with leaders or company owner or a CEO making the decision that this is something that they would like to explore. And then they would contract a consultant or a company to give them the framework of how to implement this in the workplace. So where we would start is, of course, do a profile. So we profiles for every employee. There's different type of profiles that we would advise them to do. So the senior leadership team would do like a leadership profile, because whilst it still gives you the same level of detail as the expert profile, the sort of advice and the way the profile is presented is more targeted to your leadership style.
Is there anything that you would like, that you think we haven't talked enough about, or any sort of message that you would want to give to the practitioners out there?
I think one thing that we haven't talked about that is important, and this is just from my experience, is appreciating the level of knowledge that a client or an organization in front of you may have. So what I've noticed with myself and with my peers is once we start working with strengths, we are so much in this world and almost consider it as common as, I don't know, the air that we breathe, if you want. And we often might walk into conversations with a one-on-one client or with an organization, assuming almost like a base level of knowledge. And that is a really dangerous assumption to make. So a lot of what I found and what we are finding is that a lot of clients, a lot of organizations may never heard of strengths profiles. You really need to start from scratch. You really need to start from zero. You need to be prepared in a conversation to talk about how these were developed, what are the benefits, etc. So just be prepared, I guess, is my message. And the second thing maybe that if I was to leave the listeners with one message is know your strengths really well. I can't emphasize just how important, regardless of what you're doing, regardless if your goal is to improve sort of your coaching practice or your relationship with your clients, or you want to venture into a new business strand or whatever you want to be doing. Know your strengths first. Make sure that you're on top of how they're showing up in your life, how they're impacting all of those great things that you want to do, because they're going to be just an amazing fuel to the fire.
And this is where we conclude today's session. If you're curious to dive deeper into the topic of strengths, there's quite a few ways where you can go from here. Firstly, my metaFox co-founder Max and our team are currently producing a course on the power of strengths in coaching and facilitation. It's still in the making, but you can already go to metafox.eu/course to pre-register for early access, and we'll get back to you as soon as it's done. On this course, you will also find another small demo of the strengths profile, the tool by Capfinity that Taina mentioned on today's episode and that she's working with in her practice today. Of course, you can also check it out directly on strengthsprofile.com. And lastly, you can simply wait for next week when we launch the next episode of The Making of a Coach, then again with a special episode on the making of the Strength Explorer, the assessment that we have been building at metaFox. In fact, this tool is already live on metafox.eu/Strength Explorer, and next week, Taina and I are going to have a look behind the scenes into strength psychology, building psychometric assessments, building a web application, and actually run a small demo on how coaching with the tool can look like. So stay tuned, focus on your strengths, and hear you next time on The Making of a Coach. All the best and bye-bye.
I'll make it as a coach, light the spark inside, empower every soul to turn the tide. I'll make it as a coach, help others grow, changing lives with every story I know.